Colin, it is a delight for me to have this opportunity to share this Learn to Listen series and for your yes. So, thank you so very much for joining me.
Welcome.
It's exciting to not only have you here now and to have followed just in recent years what you've done, but just the privilege I had when you were the dean at the university and the years we had there together and weekly meetings that we had. And it just has shaped me and formed me in so many ways. So I'm excited for people to hear from you because you have a wealth um, of intelligence about artistry, but the heart behind it, in particular, from a kingdom mandate, and just the things that you've written, the investigative ways you've dove into the scriptures, but just the heart for the creatives. You just, I don't know how your heart fits inside you, but it's enormous and amazing, and so such an impactful way that you've made contribution. So I'll hush and let you just share more about your story because I know you're an incredible storyteller, and we'll just continue with some questions that I'd love to ask.
Okay. Well, again, thank you so much for having me. It's such a joy to see you and to be with you. As you said, we've walked the road together in many ways for over many years, and it's been such a joy. So, my story begins in London, England, where I was born. And I was born into a very conservative Christian home where there was no room for artistic expression at all. So, whether it was in my home, my church, or my school, even actually, I didn't have any exposure to the arts. And in fact, when there were arts events that were taking place in my school, I was the one student who was never allowed to attend. So that that was my background. So how did I get into this? 55 years plus of working in the arts, and I often say it's God's joke because it was so far off the reservation for me in terms of even thinking about the arts. Well, it began with an act of rebellion. I was um, 19 years of age and I was on my way to university. And I decided that I was going to go watch a movie. And, when you think of today, young people, how many movies they've watched by the time they've got to 19, I hadn't seen any. And so this was my first experience. And it was very scary for me because I'd been brought up um, with the words that what happened, what would happen if Jesus came back and found you in a movie theater watching a movie. Now, I didn't know what would happen, but it didn't sound good. And so this was a big step for me. And the movie I went to see was What's New Pussycat.
That's
You
risque.
often hear Tom Jones singing that theme song of the movie. But you know what? I hated it. Not because of the movie, but I was so apprehensive that Jesus was going to come back and find me there at 19 years of age. But he didn't. And I survived. And, that was my first introduction to really the world of the arts. And I headed, to my college and met a young believer there. We've been lifetime friends. And he said to me, I've got a Christian rock group. Well, this was 1965, and it was the beginning of contemporary Christian music in England. And of course, the Beatles were in the charts with their Help album, and there was so much creativity going on. And so my friend said, I've got a problem. He said, my drummer's sick and I've got a gig at the weekend. And he said, have you ever played the drums before? And I just sort of laughed and I said, no, never. And he said, look, I'm really desperate. Would you be willing to try? And I said, okay. And I spent 3 days in the basement with the band practicing. And that weekend, I was in my first rock concert playing the drums. And, while I was at university, I stayed with the band and even part time afterwards, played with them for 7 years. So, what was happening, Cynthia, was that I was for the first time discovering that there was creativity within me that I had never been able to explore. But that wasn't the end of it, because one of my first classes at the university was a dance class, not dance, dance. And the D word was banned in our home. But I had to do this because it was part of my training. And so we went into the gym, mostly girls. There were 2 or 3 of us guys. And the teacher, the professor said, I'm going to put some music on, and I want you to imagine that you're a flower. Well, okay, that's interesting. And when you hear the music, I want you to open your petals slowly. And then when the music changes, I want you just to close your petals and go to sleep. And I'm thinking, get me out of here. But you know what? As I persisted with those classes, I developed a love of dance that has never left me. And I found when I moved, I could express things that I had maybe not been able to express before. And so now not only was I in a rock band, I was also doing dance classes. And extraordinary, because again, the very first time that I was able to discover and explore the creative gifts that God had placed within me. I went on to have my own dance company a number of years later, and it was called Lord of the Dance, based on the song, the folk song, Lord of the Dance. And, we did performances in different theaters in England. But my passion for the arts and for movement, particularly, spilled into every area of my teaching. I combined movement with mime and drama and developed a storytelling form that I would then put music to and have music created for. And I didn't realize how I was really growing. I was out one day, actually, with my students doing one of my productions. And this lady walked up to me and she said, "You're coming to my studio and you're going to perform this for my students." And I had a lot of pride. I'll talk about that maybe if we have a chance. But I was sort of arrogant in those days. And it was like, excuse me, I don't think we've been introduced. What do you mean I'm coming to your studio? And oh, she said, I'm so sorry. She said, my name is Valerie Preston Dunlop. And I almost fell over, because Valerie was the one that popularized the Laban movement school. She was the current director of the Laban school in London. And we had read her books while I was at college. And now, oh, nice to meet you. And she invited me to go with my kids to the Laban school. and we performed there and had a wonderful time. And she said, I want to take you to the London Contemporary Dance Company. And of course, the London Contemporary was the major modern dance company in Europe at that time. And I said, okay. So we walked into the London Contemporary. All the dancers were having a class, and she just marched in and interrupted the class. And she said, I have someone here that I want to introduce you to. And she said, this is Colin Harbinson, and he's a multimedia choreographer after the style of Nikolai. And I'm thinking, who the heck is Nikolai? But the students and the faculty seemed very impressed. But that was the journey from never mentioning the dance word to in the 70s, later 70s, having my own company and being introduced in this way. And so it's been a passion, and writing different shows, Yuma, Toymaker Son, and others have really built on that amalgamation of dance, movement, and theater. And it will come up probably here too, but a passion for storytelling, because I think it's so important. And maybe just a verse that as I I don't need to go into that, but the Lord called me out of my work in education into youth with a mission, and that took me with the arts globally. And Toymaker Son, we maybe you'll talk a little bit about that. As a result, went to over 70 different countries on 6 continents. But as I was developing my passion and love for the arts, the Lord gave me a verse, and it was Isaiah 62:10. And he spoke a number of things to me through this verse. The first is, he showed me that this was his call on my life. I didn't know clearly how it was going to work out, but it says, and it's Isaiah speaking prophetically about the children of Israel who were in exile, and that God was going to call them home and take them back to where they belonged. And it says, pass through the gates, prepare the way for the people, build up the highway, remove the stones, because of course Jerusalem had been reduced to rubble, the temple and the walls. So what did God say to me? Well, he said to me, basically, what I'm calling you to do is to be a highway builder and a stone remover. That's interesting. And, again, I didn't know fully at that point what that was, but I understood from the verse that it was preparing the way. And when I got involved in the arts in the middle of the 60s, when we went as a band and were invited by Youth for Christ to perform and evangelize through our music, when they heard us play, they prayed for us that we would get saved. The first time I took any movement into a church, I mean, it was shocking. And so when I look at where we've come, we still have a long way to go, but we've come in an amazing way. So God's call on my life was to really prepare the way for those who would come after. And that involved preparing a road, building a highway, and removing the obstacles and removing the stones that we tripped over and that we had to navigate on our journey. So in a nutshell, that's really the mandate, that God placed on my life. And maybe just one more comment. As the Lord showed me this verse and gave me an ever-growing vision, he also spoke to me that I would not see in my lifetime the fulfillment of this vision. And I was like, really? You know, Lord, you give me a vision and then you tell me I'm not going to see it become a reality fully in my lifetime? What's that? And of course, the more I grew in my understanding of the Lord, I realized that it wasn't my vision. It was God's vision. And it was a part of his restoration project for all of creation that included the arts. And I've learned to so appreciate those who have gone before and to be committed to investing in those who will come after.
Mhm.
Because as I've looked at, I love Hebrews 11, and it talks about, all those heroes of faith. And it says their faith wasn't complete without ours. You know, it's only when both come together that God's plan can be outworked. And so I have grown to understand that my life is given a context. The context is those who have prepared the way before I was on the scene, um, and those who will follow, not just me, others, pioneers who have been involved in different areas, and those it gives us a context. We're so much a part of something
Mhm.
so much bigger than our ministry, even our lifetime. And so that's really important to me. And I believe as we are obedient to what God is giving us to do, then others will follow and stand on our shoulders. So that understanding has motivated almost everything I've done
Mhm.
over the years.
So beautiful and so profound, and such an incredible foundation from which you're working. Um, I just read in the scriptures this morning, following from yesterday's readings, as I'm going through the Old Testament, and David wanting to build a permanent place where God dwells. And God made it clear that you're not going to do that. Your predecessor, your son, Solomon, will be the one. So David collected all the materials, got things in order, but his life ended and Solomon was the one to build it. So there's something in that. And then, all the Levites and their roles and all the order. So incredibly
You look
beautiful.
you look at Moses.
Yeah.
Think of all the time in the desert. I mean, what propelled him? I'm sure it was the thought of we're going to enter the promised land, and yet he didn't.
Yeah.
And so, you know, maybe we'll refer to this later, but I many artists who have walked away from God have struggled with this area of disappointment.
Mhm.
They have had an expectation in one way or the other, and there's many reasons that we can enter into disappointment. But through that disappointment, they've fallen away and actually moved out of God's will for their lives. And so, uh, yeah, there's so much in this that we can meditate on. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. Well, I'd love for you just to maybe give a brief statement about how did it go with your family as you started moving in artistic endeavors? Was it favorable? Because we don't always find it, favorable when we're leaving a cultural practice. And that's often what it is. It might be a familial tie or a way of operating. But, I
Yeah,
just think that
I can answer that with a story. My mother died when I was 9, and my father left 3 months later to live in Canada. So I was brought up with my sister by my mother's sister who had nursed her during her sickness. And so that was the family basically that I referred to, that was strict,
Right.
traditional, and so on. No place for the arts. Well, a number of years into my involvement creatively, Worship Magazine contacted me and asked me if I would do an article on the arts and worship. And they did a great job. They did visuals and so on. So when I got it, I said to Maureen, I'm going to send this to my family in England. And she said, Colin, don't do that. And I said, I mean, it's a respectable Christian magazine. I think I'm going to do it. And I did. Well, I didn't hear from my family for quite a while. And finally, I decided I better go chase them down, find out what's going on. And I spoke to my aunt. And before I could say anything to her, she said to me, well, I want to let you know that the magazine arrived. And she said, what a sad day it was for our family.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, really, just that sums up the attitude. And it's one of my biggest griefs, you know, that God was doing so much through the arts around the world, but when I went home to my family, I couldn't talk about it.
Yeah.
And when visiting relatives came when I was there, and they would say, Colin, what are you doing? My aunt would appear from the kitchen and she would put her finger over her lips, and it was just like, don't you mention the arts. And yeah, it was a challenge.
Yeah.
But I knew what God had called me to do, and that never wavered. But yeah, sad that they weren't able to recognize and enter into that.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. And I know that that's the story of others as well that have had challenge in not having the support. It's that prophet in your own hometown where you're not welcome. And it's that place of really the revelation or the fullness hasn't been revealed or accepted. It's probably been revealed, it just is not accepted. And so that narrowness and the condemnation and the legalism, and I'm not putting that on your family, I'm just in the general context.
No, I think it's
and
there. And I think that's why I have such an understanding and such a passion that Christians engaged in the arts are affirmed biblically and personally in the gifts and the calling that God has placed on their lives. And so that's been a big part. And that comes out of that. It comes out of that experience. You know, my desire to expose emerging artists at the very beginning of their development to wider creativity and opportunity to explore comes out of my lack of having that. So, as in all of our lives, so much of our passion and what God calls us to do comes out of our experiences.
Yeah, that's good. That's so good. And understanding that and identifying with that, it comes from our experiences, the abundance of or the lack thereof at times that drives us and stirs us and compels us. Yeah. So I'd love to hear some stories because you're a beautiful storyteller, and maybe weave in some of those thoughts about how you've heard the voice of God or just what leadership you've cultivated in your life, or how you admonish individuals, because I know that you're a wealth of wisdom, and I mean both in the life examples and then also the writings, and there's a lot. So I'd love for you to tackle that.
Yeah. Well, you feel free to dive in and direct and redirect, but I love the title of this series. because I think hearing the voice of God, listening, listening to others is such a key component of our lives as Christians, and certainly in a leadership context. And I think, it's for me, hearing the voice of God has been something that has grown over the years, and you get to recognize. And for me, on the surface of things, God has told me to do some pretty crazy things. And but I've recognized his voice, and when I stepped out and did it, God came through, miracle after miracle after miracle. And so the next time he speaks to you, oh yeah, I recognize that voice, and I can trust it, because when I did before, God was faithful, and God came through. So listening prayer, intercessory prayer, often we rush in. And even now, when I'm leading groups of people to pray, I will say to them, look, let's not just come to God and talk.
Yeah.
Let's listen. Let's just wait in his presence. And we bow our heads, and within 30 seconds, someone started to pray. It's so ingrained in us. And we have to train ourselves to listen. And when we listen in the presence of God, he speaks to us.
Mm-hmm.
And we can agree with what he's saying. And that's the fount of miracles, and I've seen that over and over. Um,
Uncomfortable in the silence, right? We're just uncomfortable in that silent place.
yes, yeah, absolutely. You have to fill the silence with words, and it's in the silence that we find God.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, um, God gives me a peace. How does he speak to me? Well, he speaks to me through his word and all sorts of different ways, through other people. But if I have big decisions that I have to make, I listen. And if I have a peace in my heart, that's almost always a sign that I've heard God. I
Mm-hmm.
will never make a decision if I feel any disquiet in my heart,
Mm-hmm.
because that tells me either I'm not hearing correctly, or I need to go back to the Lord to
Mm-hmm.
get some clarification and get some understanding. And it's funny, I envision myself as walking around with an antenna
That's
on
good.
my head,
Yeah.
um, because over the years I've learned to attune myself to what God might be saying. So I may be talking to you and listening to you, but those antennas are on,
Mm-hmm.
and they're listening. And so it's just a subconscious thing, I think, now. It's just that listening this way, and then listening that way.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm in a conversation or making a decision or whatever I'm doing, that antenna is
Mm-hmm.
up.
Mm-hmm.
And it has to be.
Yeah.
Because, one of the things, Cynthia, that I found is, when I joined Youth with a Mission, I was 21 years and traveled, all around the world, never any salary. So we had to believe the Lord for our meals and our travel. And you know what? When you have a family and you have to believe the Lord for your next meal, you listen to the Lord and you make sure that you're in that zone when you can hear what he's saying to you. And it really, those years forced me, to listen carefully, because God was leading us on a day-to-day
Mm-hmm.
basis.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, that's really important. I've just picked up Madeline Engel's book, Walking on Water
Oh
Again,
yeah.
and
This is
I love that, and I'm enjoying it more this time around. But she talks about listening, and I love what she says, because she says, as we are in the creative process, as we are creating, as we're listening to our materials, as we're listening to the artwork we're creating, and as we're listening to the Lord in that process, this is what she says, and it blows me away every time I say it. She says, your art will know more than you do.
Mhm.
And I just love that.
Mhm.
I mean, how many times have you had people come up to you and say, Cynthia, that work you choreographed was, when this happened, it was so inspired. And I'm sure you've had the same as I've had. Well,
Yeah.
actually, I didn't consciously put that in there,
Right.
you know, but it's there
Yeah.
because as we listen
Yeah.
to the work, as we listen to the Lord, our art knows more
Yeah.
than we do.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter your intention of why you created.
Yeah.
People come from their own framework of reference.
Mhm.
They will interpret it in a way that's meaningful to them. But the thought that all the great works of art that we have that deeply, profoundly impact us as classical works,
Mhm.
um, and she says, you know, Bach's work knew more than Bach did.
Yeah.
The painters, their work knew more than they did.
Yeah.
And that's inviting God into the listening process, in the process of creating, which I think is just so profound and so
Oh,
important.
it is. It is. And I love the understanding that God is the ultimate artist. And with Him being the ultimate artist, and we go to God to cultivate our artistic craftswomanship, our skills. And so we've got that going for us. But I just even think about what you just said. If you have one person in the audience viewing, if it's a dance or a theatrical production, it has that much wisdom in the art presentation. But if the audience is there, the art's going to have so much more wisdom in it just because of all of the interpretations and all of the experiences that are coming into that room to take that art on and to ingest it. So, yeah, it's an incredible thought.
Yeah, it just blesses me. Well, in the 90s, the Lord began to lead me to work. I'd worked internationally, but to organize international cultural exchanges.
Mhm.
And this was another experience of listening for me. Um, I'd gone with Toymaker Son and different productions into all these different nations. And that's great. But there can be a sort of an arrogance that creeps in, that, we go to another country, you don't know anything about God, you know, you're an atheistic country, and I'm going to come and tell you, about the Lord, and I'm going to tell you, what you need to hear. We don't articulate that, but that's how it can come across. And what I found with these festivals is that I learned to listen at a deeper level,
Mhm.
because it wasn't just us going to perform. We actually did a cultural exchange. So we went and saw their art. We performed alongside them. We rehearsed alongside them. We developed relationships with them. And much as we often think, particularly in Russia, China, these communist countries as they were, as China still is, that God isn't working, hasn't spoken. But he has. It's so arrogant of us to think that God has not already spoken into them, into their narrative, their cultural narrative, their personal
Mhm.
narrative. And so what I learned was to listen, you know, before I say anything, to invite them to tell me
Mhm.
their story
Mhm.
without any spiritual overtones. Just tell me, I'm interested in you and in your art form, and just tell me your story. And as you listen, they begin to open up and they begin to tell you, you know, spiritual truths. And you realize, my goodness, God has been working in their lives. And now he's brought me into relationship with them. Now I want that antenna to go up. And I'm going to say, Lord, do you want me to say anything?
You're right.
No, but do you want me to be quiet?
Yeah.
Because you're obviously working.
Yes.
And if you want me to say something, what is it you want me to say?
Yeah.
So, and I think there are times when God speaks to us in profound ways,
Mhm.
life altering ways.
Mhm.
And one of those happened when I was invited after the fall of communism in the Soviet Union. I was invited by the new government to come over and do the first East West cultural exchange. I mean, what an amazing opportunity. Honestly, I wasn't looking for it, but I got the invitation. And so I went over, and this was just prior to the coup, the attempted coup. And then when the coup failed, Yeltsin stood on the tank, you know, in Red Square. And I was there just prior to that and immediately after that. And the new government said to me, we want you to organize this cultural exchange with artists from the West. And they said, there's something else that we have a favor to ask of you. And they said, we have a palace in the middle of St. Petersburg that has been the headquarters of the Communist Party for 70 years. And it has a terrible reputation. Could we ask you to help us to rehabilitate it? And I said, well, what do you have in mind? And they said, well, we want to take you down to the palace. And so they walked me down to the palace, and I stood outside this building, and it was sealed because when they threw out all the communists, they sealed the doors so they couldn't get back in. And we had to wait for a little while. And then they finally got the word, and they then went and broke the seals on the door. And they said, now this is your palace. Well, you know, I've said before, being English, you know, I've never been offered a palace before, so this is pretty exciting. But when I saw the seals being broken, this was the profound moment that I believe God spoke to me in. And he said, just as you've seen these closed doors broken open, I'm going to open the doors of nations closed to my truth, and I'm going to do it through the arts. And that was, you know, a second calling almost for me after the Isaiah 62:10. And God was saying clearly, I'm interested in the nations. I'm going to open nations that are closed to my truth, and I'm going to do it through the arts. Well, they took me inside, down the corridor to the door of the leader of the Communist Party, and it was sealed. They broke it and they said, Colin, this is your office. And I went in and sat on the desk and looked behind me, and there was a picture of Lenin hanging on the wall, and it was just surreal, you know. But that moment was profound in what God spoke to me. So I went back to my hotel. I didn't have to wait long for God to actually do what he said, because as I went back to my hotel, the phone rang, and it was a voice on the other end of the phone. Um, and I think it was probably a translator, but they were saying um, the new government has just finished its first session in the palace, and they named the palace. And we have just changed the name of Leningrad back to St. Petersburg. And we want you to come quickly because we want you to address the whole new government. I mean, seriously? I mean, how does that happen? But even as I was struggling with that, God said, I told you, I'm going to open the doors of nations. And I rushed. They provided a car for me, rushed to the palace, and the cameras were rolling. The mayor greeted me and introduced the interpreter, translator, and he just said, speak to us. And I had no idea, but I just opened my mouth and God just filled it. And that night, it was reported on the evening news that went out to St. Petersburg, Moscow, and beyond to over 40 million people. And when they zoomed in for a soundbite, they zoomed into where I said Christians around the world are praying for you at this significant moment in your nation. And, you know, absolutely extraordinary. And today, that first palace that was the headquarters of the Communist Party is now known as one of the premier performing arts centers in St. Petersburg. And so amazing, amazing. And just shortly after that, I wasn't sure. I knew now that we had stumbled on something extraordinary because just a couple of months later, I brought 375 artists from 35 countries, along with some spiritual leaders, for this cultural exchange. And it, again, we don't have time to go into it, but what God did, I saw the arts transcend culture, language, religion, politics, and I saw God do extraordinary things. And a couple of years later, I went to Bulgaria and I met with the vice president of Bulgaria, who said, we would like to have the next festival in Bulgaria. And so that's what we did. And we brought artists around. We had an amazing cultural exchange, you know, with their philharmonic, their symphony, their dancers, their actors. I mean, all top artists in the country. And at the end of it, I got a phone call from a television station, and we've been doing interviews all the way through. And this person said, I don't know, you know, if you know that our television station is the #1 in the country, and 4 million people tune in every day to listen. And he said, this festival has so impacted our country. It's interesting what he said. He actually said, this festival has broken the silence in our country. And he said, we want you to come to the studio. And so I went, and it was the day before I was to leave. And I got there, and there was a chair, 3 cameras, and the logo of the festival. And he said, please sit in that chair, and would you address the nation? Like, oh my goodness. You know, I mean, the first feeling is like shock and addressing the nation. And second is, what the heck am I going to say? And then quickly, the Lord said, I'm going to open the doors of nations that are closed to my truth. And I'm going to do it through the arts. Well, I did my talk. Again, God just gave me the words. And I was told afterwards that when I left, that interview or my talk was actually shown 3 times a day for 3 weeks. And again, just the amazing things that God does. But again, the importance of listening to God, listening to other people, and I just find it fascinating that there's such secrecy in the nation, such with communism, such fear that people couldn't speak out, and yet he said, "This festival has broken the silence in our nation." The power of the arts to speak truth. Do I have time for one more?
Absolutely, yes. Just bring us home with whatever story and just nuggets because they're so intriguing and it's so incredibly inspiring and just makes me so much more in love with God again and again. So, yes,
Uh,
please do.
that's great. Well, you know, it's times like this, Cynthia, when I get a chance to talk about them, that it just stirs up within me, and you shake yourself and say, "Did that really happen?" And it did, and it inspires you, you know, to continue to just trust God for the impossible. Excuse me here, I've got a little bit of a sniffle here this morning. Um, Maybe one more story about China, because China was the third country that asked us to go and do the festival there. And I took 300 artists from was it 30, maybe 20 different countries there to do this, that the Chinese said was the largest festival of its kind in the history of China. And so here we are, 30, 300 believers. And we get to the airport and we are greeted by the government leaders, top government leaders. We're danced to our bus by about 100 minority dancers, all in their tribal regalia, singing, dancing us to the bus. Now we're talking about communist China. And so we get in the bus and we drive down the highway. Every bridge we went under was a huge banner. Welcome, International Festival of the Arts. And the opening gala that we did um, was a joint performance with their artists and ours. Um, 7 television stations covered it from coast to coast in China. China's a big place. Nationwide coverage. 15 newspapers were there to cover it. So the whole festival, we just got day and night blanket coverage on television, um, excerpts of what we were doing, and it was quite extraordinary. And one of the things I've been to China, you know, probably about 10 different times, but one of the things that I've always wanted to do is to do Handel's Messiah, because it was banned during the communist era. And so what I felt part of what we were to do there was Handel's Messiah. So I brought over with me a Canadian broadcaster and conductor, and a Canadian choir that had just recorded Handel's Messiah. I'd been already working with an orchestra in the south of China, and I asked them if they would be the orchestra, and they agreed. So they had never heard the work of Messiah. And what I did was I got the words, which of course are right out of scripture, I had them translated into Chinese and put them in the computer. And when we came to the performance in the main concert hall in that city, there were electronic screens either side of the stage, scrolling down the words of scripture in Chinese. So here was an orchestra that had never played it before, playing to over 1,000 people who had packed into the concert hall, who had never heard it before, and they were reading the words of scripture for the first time. And when we finished, I looked around, and honestly, I couldn't see anybody that just wasn't weeping their heart out. And when it had finished, they pumped the recording that they had done of the show out into the open air. So basically, it was going out beyond the concert hall. And the next day, the communist newspaper that went out to tens of millions headlined, "Messiah touches hearts." And the newspaper said, if you were there at this performance of Messiah and you were touched and moved, please write your story into the, newspaper, and we will publish. And people, all sorts of people wrote in about how they'd been touched, how they'd been moved, and they published it in the newspaper. And the next day, the leader of the Communist Party and the governor of the province contacted me, because they were both there, and they said, we want copies of that music. And so the next day I met with them and gave them CDs, DVDs CDs of Handel's Messiah. If we'd have stood on a street corner and opened our Bibles and read out of Isaiah, we'd have been on the first plane home. But because it was the arts, because it was beautiful, because it was creative, they received it and received it into their hearts and their spirits. One more just quick addition to that. The director of culture, the minister of culture, said to me, I'm going to be introducing this performance tonight. And she said, and how you'd like me to introduce it? Well, I'm being very careful, because you have to be wise. And we believe the art could speak powerfully, truth by itself. So I said, well, it's actually based on some ancient Hebrew literature. And, it's been performed all around the world. And she said, thank you. And then I'm in the audience sitting there waiting for the concert to start. And she comes up and she says, we're going to now listen to a concert of Handel's Messiah. And she said, this musical work is about the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. I mean, she was bolder than I was. But this is the power of the arts, to break down closed doors and to speak truth and beauty in powerful ways. I've talked a lot, so I probably should stop talking.
Well, before we started recording, I said we could do probably 10 series easily with just you and sharing and um, just the stories, because God has filled your life with stories, and these are a few of hundreds of stories, Colin. And I just bless you and thank you for your faithfulness. Thank you for the thousands upon thousands of people that you've affected, that are artists, that are kingdom artists, that have chosen to be more brave, to be more bold, to be more courageous, investigative in their art, to understand their identity. You bring that, you bring a greater perspective of how this broken world needs what we offer as artists. And that's just for the artist kingdom. And then there's thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people who have been affected because of their yes being encouraged and inspired by you, then the infiltration that's gone out globally. So I think often about the scriptures, and I know that it's what it is. It's those books that have been created for us to be inspired by. I feel like the scriptures continue to be written, and I know that there should be a book of Colin where we would have more stories of God's faithfulness, because what you do points directly to
Absolutely.
finished work of Jesus. So thank you, thank you, thank you for joining today, and thank you for your continued impact. And I would love just to finish off with this book that is that you've written, that has a story behind it, and how we can get access to that. I will get other things accessible on this talk where people can link into you, but tell about the latest publication before we close.
Okay, just briefly. I wrote Toymaker and Son as an allegory of the gospel, and that's the one that I've referred to that's, been performed around the world. And we did it for 30 years and decided that we should stop. Felt like that was the right time. And over the last few years, I have had an increasing desire to tell this story to a new generation. And it had such impact, not only with children, but military and every in between. And so that's what I did. A couple of years ago, I began the process with a friend of mine, Brian Pollard, who lives in New Zealand, and he's an accomplished illustrator. And we did the book and illustrated it for 8 to 12-year-olds. And we've had a limited number that have been sent to me. It's not going to be fully launched for another week or so, but adults are buying it, and not just kids. So it's wonderful. So my prayer is that, again, in a whole other medium, that this story will continue to touch lives. Interesting process creatively to take a stage show that's nonverbal and turn it into a children's book. And that's a whole other story. But yeah, the creative process has been very interesting, and I'm excited to get it out there.
Well, we know that God inspires, and I think sometimes we limit ourselves in thinking that this is, our particular pathway. But really, if that living, breathing Word of God, the living, breathing Artist of Artists, is continuing to fill us and inspire us, then let's be open to His expressions as we are a conduit for His glory to be revealed. And not to be surprised in
Yeah,
how that might in any time and in any season. And so again, thank you, Colin, so very much from the depth of my heart. Thank you for all that you've imparted to me personally, and to, again, the countless many who have been inspired by you and directed and encouraged and taught by you. So thank you.
thank you. Can I say I love you? I do.
Oh, absolutely. I love you dearly, my friend.
Thank you.
Thank you.